Hello there, everyone. Can someone give me a thumbs up that you are hearing me okay, that the audio, right out of the box. Warren/Melinda, thank you. All right, we'll be with you in a few minutes.
Can't detect the camera. Check the device and what do you say?
Just a reminder to everyone to please shut off your own devices, meaning not the camera, but put yourself on mute just so that we're not hearing you talking with those in your household, etc. Thanks. Well, good evening, everyone. It's just now 7 o'clock Eastern Time. Those of you who've been with us for several weeks now know that I always wait exactly 1 minute for other stragglers to join. So at 7:01, I'll come right on and we will begin. See you in a minute. Well, Erev Tov to everyone. Welcome to Inside Israel. Today is December 11th, 2023, coming to you tonight from, of all places, Naples, Florida, where I'm in town for the Jewish Book Council Festival. We'll be appearing here in Naples tomorrow night, as well as on Wednesday during the day. So if you happen to live in this part of Florida on the West Coast, please drop by. You can check out on my website exactly where I'll be, but it's at the Chabad of Naples tomorrow evening. And before we begin with the Israel news, I want to make what I consider an exciting announcement. Many of you have been in touch to ask, where can I see or hear recordings if I miss an episode? If I'm not able to log on, where can I hear the recording? And for several weeks now, I've said that technically I'm working on getting that up and running, but now it is official. Inside Israel is a podcast that you can find on Spotify and also on Apple iTunes. And I'm going to go ahead and put the links right there. So that's the first one is the Apple podcast link. The second one is the Spotify podcast link. And the third is my own website where you can sign up for my mailing list. That is where I'm always going to continue to send out the links for these live broadcasts and conversations. But if you can go ahead when you do have a chance and hop on there, just click subscribe or follow or whatever it says on those various podcast platforms. That way you will automatically get the recording straight to your podcast player. And in the future, I'll be working with other podcast players as well, like Google Play and others. But for now, iTunes and Spotify are the biggest ones with the largest audience. And I'm happy to say you can find those there. Doesn't mean you can still reach out to me. Of course, you always can. And the recordings, the actual video recordings of these, if you want to see them, will be on YouTube and on my website. I always send out the links to those on Thursday in the newsletter. But for now, feel free to go ahead and subscribe and follow to the podcast. You'll hear all of this there. Well, this week I actually want to start on a personal level. The war has touched my family in some very personal ways, some very unexpected ways in this past week. One of them touching and inspiring, and in the other ways, really much less so. And I'll explain each one. But I thought that I would start here. The idea being that sometimes the personal is also the most universal. And as it turns out, I do think that what my family is going through right now is very much emblematic of what so many Israelis are experiencing. And I think you'll see why. So, on the slightly inspiring front, one of my two elder kids, one of my twins, got called up to reserve duty yesterday and had to spend, I'm kidding you not, had to spend 2 hours looking in our apartment for the boots because when you leave the army, you are given a pair of boots, but it's already been a year and a half and she's been to South America and traveled and worked. And so, it was probably my fault or my wife's that we put those boots somewhere else in a little less convenient place. And finally, we found them in a storage box under our bed. We have one of those IKEA beds that flips up and there's storage underneath, and her boots were in there, but she was able to find them and find her uniform. And she reported for duty today for the first time. And it's a very meaningful job. Her job, which actually has nothing to do with what she did in the Army itself. In the Army, she worked in logistics and manpower, assigning officers to different combat units, reported directly to the assistant to the chief of staff. So had a very high up job in central command. But for this, it's a more economic job. She's working to help distribute money to families who have a member of the family serving in the reserves, and therefore their income is diminished or they have financial hardships. And she told me that, even today on the phone in her very first day on the job, it was extremely meaningful when people were hearing that they were going to receive, even 2,000 shekels, which is about 600 and something dollars, that some of the wives broke down into tears. It really is going to make a huge difference in their lives. So it means a lot to me as someone who moved to Israel when I was 24, specifically to serve in the Israeli army and to be a lone soldier. To now see one of my kids getting called up to reserves and doing something so extremely meaningful during this war, um, you know, it touches my heart. And I got to say, there's that phrase, like father, like son, like father, like daughter. This kind of work, she really takes after her mom, my wife Dorit. My wife Dorit has been volunteering nonstop, and this kind of work is very much in the type of work that Dorit does. And so kudos to her for here as well. So that is one way that the war has touched my family. And I'm sorry to say that's really the only kind of uplifting and inspiring way. The other few are quite sad. So we'll start with her twin sister. Um, my other eldest daughter, Stav, lost a very close friend this week in Gaza. His name is Omri Ben Shachar. And before she went to the army, Stav went to Sri Lanka to travel with a friend, and they met, wherever you go in the world, you meet Israelis, and specifically these young Israelis who are either just out of the army or just before the army. And this young man that they, really just developed a close friendship. Omri Ben Shachar, they hung out so much in Sri Lanka and took trips together and went hiking together. And we got the news, well, Stav got the news on, I believe it was Saturday night, that Omri had been killed in Gaza. He was in a pretty elite unit known as Duvdevan, and I guess what you'd say peacetime, although Israel never is at peacetime. This is a unit that sort of operates inside the territories, inside the West Bank, sometimes even living there overnight, undercover, and then at the last minute, they help lead arrest operations. And Omri was a great guy, and he unfortunately was killed Saturday night. So Stav went to the funeral yesterday with her friend that she had traveled to Sri Lanka with. And like so many funerals right now, thousands of people there. She couldn't get up close to the family, but the family was crushed. What really got me here, and this is sort of an unknown phenomenon that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, is that Omri, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, we need to say. Omri had a girlfriend that they were together probably 6 or 7 years, and this has gotten so little attention, the girlfriend phenomenon in Israel. Anytime there is a war, and I remember this happened in 2014 with Operation Tzuk Eitan, there was suddenly a little bit of attention called to all these girlfriends who had been left behind. So often we think about the parents and the siblings, and it's all horribly sad. But what we often overlook are the girlfriends. These are not just little casual flings. These are often girlfriends who've been with their guys since, high school, and they're already sort of planning what their lives together will be like down the road in the future. And in this case, Omri did have a very serious girlfriend that talked about getting married at some point. Omri was 25. He was a reserve soldier, and
Hello.
he. Yeah, I need to ask you to.
Yeah,
I need to ask you to turn off your
very
mic.
exciting.
Okay. If it happens again, guys, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to remove that person. In any case, he left a girlfriend behind, and that's another angle of this story here. Another life that is crushed and ruined, but in not quite the same and obvious way. So I do want to point out to the girlfriends as well who are losing their boyfriends. Right now, we're at 101 soldiers who have been killed in this Gaza war. Uh, Another story, I have a team, and I got to thank the team behind me for helping to get this podcast launched. It's Yael, it's Mia, it's Jonah, and I'm also, in addition to being, maybe their boss. I don't don't like that word so much, but I guess their employer. We're also team members and we're also friends. And Yael lost a close friend this week. As it turns out, by coincidence, Yael was also in the 188th Armored Brigade as a medic. And if you pay attention to the news and watch it from the Israeli point of perspective, you'll see 188 appears a lot. The 188th Armored Brigade is very active in this war in Gaza. And Yael lost a friend. There were 3 tank soldiers from 188 killed this week, and she lost one. It was within the same 24 hours that my daughter Stav had lost her friend. And then there's the one that sort of hits closest to me. As you know, I've written 4 books, and the most recent one is Israel 201. It came out last spring for Israel's 75th birthday. And one thing that was really important to me was to write a chapter about the Israeli army, but an aspect that most people didn't know about. So I wrote a few of them. I wrote a chapter on lone soldiers who are actually from Israel. These are people who are disconnected from their families. Maybe they've been disowned because they're ultra-Orthodox and they decide to serve in the army, or maybe their parents are abusive and have drug problems or alcoholic and they run away from home and they become lone soldiers. So that was one of my favorite chapters. But another one that I wrote is I wanted to write about LGBTQ in the IDF. The Israeli army opened up its ranks and said that you can serve openly in the early 90s. That means well, let's do the math, well over just about 30 years now, we've had openly gay and lesbian soldiers serving in the IDF. The IDF, as it turns out, will help pay for transition surgery for soldiers who need to transition. And, to me, this is just another whole irony of how we have so many LGBTQ people in the United States standing up for Hamas and Palestine and, completely ignoring what would happen to them if they were to out themselves in Gaza. Meanwhile, you have the Israeli army that is welcoming them and paying for them to transition as should they need. Well, for that chapter, I wanted to write this chapter, and it's called LGBTQ IDF in Israel 201. I reached out to a number of soldiers who are openly gay and lesbian in the IDF. And there was this one, I had a great interview with this one woman named Naomi. And she called me on Sunday and she said, "Did you ever interview my friend Jonathan?" And it turns out that I had. I had interviewed Jonathan several times. In the end, he decided he didn't want to appear in the book itself because he wasn't ready to be public in that way. But it turned, Naomi told me the story that about 2 months ago, he reached out to her and said, "I need that author, his phone number. I want to talk to him again." And so he got in touch with me and told me that he had actually come out. He's from the United States, by the way. He's from upstate, I think upstate New York. And he had come out to two members of his platoon, and he said it was difficult being gay in the Israeli army, but they've accepted me, and I'm in the platoon, and sort of gave me that update. And then a month ago, he got in touch again and said that we're heading to Gaza. And we had a phone conversation. And he was straight up telling me the truth, how scared he was. And I had been to Lebanon back when I was a soldier. And so I told him, I was shaking literally the night before I went to Lebanon, but it's natural to be scared. Everything will be okay. And he said, "Yeah, but my commander just got killed, and two other guys in my unit were injured, and we're going to replace them. I'm really scared something's going to happen." And I really did my best to try to assure him that you can't control that, but chances are you will be okay. And alas, on Sunday, he was killed in Gaza. He was in Honda Sakravi, which is combat engineers. This is a very, very combat intense unit. They use huge tractors and bulldozers to basically, they're the ones who are most responsible for finding the tunnels and then blowing up the tunnels. But they also deal with explosives and mines and basically anything that can explode. Honda Sakravi, they are the ones, combat engineers, they're the ones dealing with it. And Jonathan was killed on Sunday. And so that was, I guess, eerie for me because I had spoken to him literally a couple days before he went into Gaza. I had a voice recording I still have voice recordings of him on my phone, one of which I listened to afterwards, where he was just talking about his experience. And the last thing he said to me in our conversation, I said, "Look, when you come back after this, I want to write about your experience in Gaza. Try to remember it." And he said, "I'll have no problem remembering it because I'm keeping a journal." So when I spoke to Naomi the other day on Sunday and she gave me the news, by the way, Sunday's yesterday. It feels like weeks ago, which is why I keep saying, but it was only, time is sort of expanding now. But when I talked to Naomi on Sunday and I told her this and I said, "There's a journal," she is now hard at work trying to track down this journal. Jonathan is a guy who wanted his story to be told. He has a very unique story. Was not raised Jewish, found Judaism at an older age, went through a conversion. Of course, had the whole coming out side of his story. He wanted his story to be told. So my hope is that Naomi will find this journal and will be able to get more of his story out somehow. But those were some ways in which this war has touched me personally this past week. And I want to make clear, by no means am I the only one. This is what is happening in Israel. Israelis all over the country are going to shivas. They're going to funerals, sometimes of soldiers they know, sometimes of soldiers they don't know, but it's someone from their town, and that's what you do. You turn out and you support by going. There's no such thing as a funeral with fewer than a few hundred or even fewer than 1,000. I mean, these funerals are very sad and huge, and they're community events, and all Israelis are doing that. And slightly related, and actually very much related, is a very big piece of news out of Israel since the last time we all spoke. And that is that Gadi Eisenkot. He is one of the people who joined the emergency cabinet in order to help navigate this war. You know, a lot of people, myself included, would be very suspicious if Netanyahu were the only one navigating this war. To put it simply, we don't really trust him anymore, and the numbers back this up. You know, as I've mentioned before, his approval rating is only at about 20% right now. And in one survey, 4%, that's 4% of Israelis said that they rely on Netanyahu as a trustworthy source of news related to the war. So only 4% at this point. And there's really no way this war could happen and move forward if we didn't have others planning it and executing it as well. And we had two really significant people join his emergency cabinet. One of them is Benny Gantz, and the other is Gadi Eisenkot. And you know, they are both former chiefs of staff, former generals. They're also politicians, but they're more on the quiet side. They're not out there for the bluster, making speeches. They're more about getting the job done. Gadi Eisenkot, especially. And like I said, he's a former chief of staff, and his son was killed in Gaza this past week. And the day after, his nephew was killed in Gaza. And this really affected the country on many levels. First of all, we hear the names of soldiers, we see their faces, but when the person running the war, in charge of running the war, and he said, you know, he's a very sensitive man, Eisenkot. He said when he was joining the war cabinet, I'm going to run this war as if my son is on the front lines and if my daughter has been kidnapped and is in Gaza. And then he kind of, with a smile, said, and by the way, my son is on the front lines. So no, his daughter is not in Gaza, but his son was on the front lines. And it turned out was in a very elite unit and was killed this week. And it not only put a real face on it for Israelis, but it also drove home the idea that in Israel, everyone is vulnerable. This is everyone's war. It's a true citizens' army. I don't think there are many countries in the world where the chief of staff, certainly not in America, you wouldn't hear that the chief of staff has his son on the front lines in a war. If anything, in the U.S., you use your connections in the military that your dad or mom has to try to get into a good college or get a good job or get out of military service. But in Israel, people use their connections. If they're fortunate enough to have a father who's a former chief of staff, they use that connection to get a good job in the army, the most elite unit possible. And he's not the only one, the son of Eisenkot. Another example that comes to mind is President Isaac Herzog. The president of Israel also said that his son is on the front lines in Gaza right now. And he didn't say what unit he's in or where he's serving. But this really is a citizen's army, as we say in Hebrew, tzva ha'am, where everyone serves, even the son of the president and even the son of the former chief of staff who is now in charge of leading this war. And one other little twist I want to present here, and this is more just an idea, not something I've fully fleshed out yet, but this summer, Gadi Eisenkot, the former chief of staff who's in the war cabinet, he was very adamant about telling Netanyahu that Netanyahu's judicial overhaul plan needed to be stopped, that it was doing damage to the military, that it was making Israel look weak to its enemies, and that it was giving our enemies a chance to attack. And Netanyahu clearly, ignored him like he ignored so many others. And I just wonder if there is now a personal element to this war, if there is a personal feeling of Eisenkot toward Netanyahu, an anger, a disappointment, a sense of you did this to not just the country, but to my son, that my son died because of you. I'm totally riffing here and hypothesizing, but you could see how that would happen because this is someone who told Netanyahu many times that he was endangering the country by putting such high priority on judicial reform and the West Bank and the settlers and not paying attention to Gaza. And lo and behold, his own son has been killed in battle. So uh, that sort of story relates both to what I was going through and loops to the bigger picture of what so many Israelis are right now. I want to turn to the issue of the hostages. I actually have a little bit of intelligence. I was able to talk to someone off the record, but who's high up. And again, nothing is certain, but I'm going to relate what I heard and also add my own take on it, just based of what I know in general. What I heard from this person inside the military is that it is largely assumed that we are going to get back at this point all the hostages we have gotten back. There is not much thought that we are going to get more back. Now, look, I hope he's wrong. He hopes he's wrong. Um, we definitely want all the hostages back. But you can understand the logic here, and let me explain it to you. It's in Hamas's interest to have as long of a truce as possible. The longer a truce there is, the more Hamas can regroup, the more they can get fuel and humanitarian aid into the strip. And when I say humanitarian aid, let's be clear, this is aid that is going to be stolen by them and not go to the people. Why is fuel so important for Hamas? As I've pointed out before, because in these underground tunnel networks, they are so deep. We're talking 70 meters down below ground, not a couple feet below ground. They're so deep and so long and extensive that there is no oxygen down there. So they rely on generators to pump electricity to pump electrically oxygen down into the tunnels. That is why the fuel is so important. And it's why these truces are so important. They give Hamas a chance to keep their tunnel network going, to keep hiding, to keep regrouping. So the question is, why wouldn't Hamas release more prisoners? Maybe you could understand why they're not releasing male hostages or military soldiers, but there are still women and children who have not been released. And what many believe is that, what I'm hearing is that many believe is that those hostages have either been killed or they are in such bad shape that Hamas does not want to let them out and have their stories be heard by Israel and by the rest of the world. We're already hearing from hostages who've been released that many have been sexually abused, both men and women, both adults and children, while they were held captive. And especially now with so many of with the women who haven't been released, but children as well, it is believed that perhaps they have been abused so badly that they don't want their story to come out and to be told. So that is why there are many who believe that we've seen all the hostages we are going to see. And also on a logical level, you would have to assume that Hamas would be making demands for another ceasefire and saying that we should have another truce to release more hostages. But they really haven't said anything like that. Now, believe me, I hope I'm absolutely wrong, and I would love to come back next week and tell you that I missed this by a mile. Uh, but I'm just telling you what I have heard, and the logic does sort of back it up. Now, that said, Hamas has made three demands right now, in saying they will, release the hostages, or actually, what they said is we will release no more hostages unless these three demands are met. And once you hear the three demands, you can think for yourselves how likely it is that the demands would be met. First of all, that the war in Gaza end. That is demand number one from Hamas. Number two is that the IDF immediately leave Gaza. And number three is that all prisoners in Israeli prisons be released, all Arab Palestinian prisoners, including the several hundred who were captured on October 7th and who perpetrated the October 7th attacks. Now, I think we all know that it is impossible. There is no way Israel will meet any of those three demands, especially not that third one. There is no way they're going to release the several hundred Gazan Hamas members who who snuck into Israel on October 7th and carried out these attacks. There is debate right now about what exactly to do with them, perhaps holding some sort of public trial so the story can be told publicly to the rest of the world. There's talk about bringing back the death penalty. Israel does have the death penalty. However, it's only been used once on Adolf Eichmann. Even murderers do not get the death penalty. It's never carried out in Israel. We're just so uncomfortable with the idea of putting someone to death in that way that we haven't used it. But there is debate of bringing it back for these prisoners. But I can assure you that we are not going to release these prisoners who carried out the October 7th attacks. And I think that's what Hamas is doing. They're making these demands as if they have legitimate demands, when the truth is they know that these demands will never be met, which also means they can now blame Israel for the hostages not being released when it's clear from the beginning that they don't have any intention of releasing them in the first place. So that is what I believe is the situation on the hostages right now. Again, I hope the news is different, but it would seem that this is the case. Now, that links to a story that we've talked about here a few times, the idea of flooding the tunnels. It could be that the IDF, if it ever reaches the conclusion that it really has no chance to bring back hostages alive, would it then put into action this possible plan of flooding the tunnels? And I believe it could. We have already 5 water pumps that are set up, ready to pump water from the Mediterranean Sea into different points of the tunnel network. Right now, the sort of another debate that I've been hearing is that there's environmental questions. There's very little drinkable water in Gaza. There is an aquifer, but I think only 3% of it is not contaminated. And so there's sort of a question is if we pump all of this water into the tunnels, what does it do to the soil? What does it do to the ground? Does it cause some sort of an environmental problem that would make Gaza unlivable for people to move back once this is over? And other people have countered that all of the rubble and all the destruction and all the bombings, that's its own environmental problem, and pumping water into the tunnels would be no worse than that. But I would say that it's still on the table, and the more it would look that the hostage situation would not be resolved with returned hostages, the more possible and perhaps even likely it would be that flooding would become an option. Another big story in Israel this week is the spokesman for the IDF, kind of in a blasé way, extremely casually, just mentioned that, yeah, after the war in Gaza is over, we're probably going to have a war in the north. An offhand comment he made. And it, of course, became very big news, and it's been talked about quite a bit. But I will tell you that the average Israeli right now, the average Yossi and Tali that you meet on the street, they are likely assuming that there is going to be a war with Hezbollah in the north at the conclusion of the war right now in Gaza, or perhaps overlapping slightly. And I want to explain why. As bad as the Hamas threat is, we were talking 25 to 30,000 Hamas militants on October 7th total, 2 to 3,000 who were able to get into Israel. Hezbollah is at least 4 times as large. We're looking at 100 to 150,000 members of Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And there's a fear in Israel that they could do in the north exactly what Hamas did in the south: break through the fence, drive in, start firing at will. Uh, and if we've learned anything from October 7th, it's that we cannot have an enemy who is capable living so close to us. Um, that's why Israelis are so hesitant to have a two-state solution um, right now. It's even though the U.S. is talking about a two-state solution, the idea of an enemy living so near to us, when Israel at its widest point is only 12 miles across, it's really unthinkable to many Israelis. And so the idea of just containing Hezbollah and keeping our eye on Hezbollah in the north, when at any moment they could break through or attack with missiles. That was the strategy up until about 2 months ago, 3 months ago. Now Israel's rethinking that and thinking that this isn't a situation where we'd wait for Hezbollah to attack and then we would counterattack. that we might take the initiative. And between you and me, I would say that it's pretty much guaranteed that right now, many high up officers in the Israeli army are putting together plans for what that attack of of Hezbollah in the north will look like. We just can't live with that threat so close to us. But if you're wondering what are Israelis talking about this week, that is a big thing that Israelis are talking about because it really adds this other sense of, we're always talking about the day after, the day after. Well, the day after, there's going to be another war, and it's going to have its own day after. So that is a big point of discussion right now. Some other news coming out of Israel. Excuse me one second. Some other news coming out of Israel is that it does seem like Hamas is losing something in Gaza. What is that something? Power, credibility, unity. Someone asked a really good question. Why is the IDF stripping prisoners to their underwear before they transport them? And the US has already responded. We are really disturbed by these pictures, and you can understand why. They're reminiscent of Abu Ghraib. They give the idea of us humiliating prisoners. Let me explain what this is and how it relates to Hamas possibly losing power and falling apart. Uh, Northern Gaza has, for the most part, been cleared. 90% of northern Gaza people have evacuated. It's largely assumed that the 10% is remaining are Hamas. There are definitely still Hamas militants in northern Gaza. We've had rockets hit central Israel this week, which really only can happen if they're launched from northern Gaza. So they are there, and any men that we're coming across, two things are happening. Some we're arresting and capturing, but others are turning themselves in, including some militant Hamas members are actually turning themselves in. And you can see video online of them holding their rifles above their head and putting them in a pile while they're in their underwear. As for why they're in their underwear, it's not a humiliation technique. It is simply because the way Hamas operates, they are known to have suicide bombs on them so that if Israeli troops get close, they would detonate themselves. They have weapons that can't be seen over their clothing. So this is why they need to be stripped down to their underwear. And I am sorry if it looks humiliating, but this, for the sake of our own soldiers, this is the way it needs to be done. And the IDF has said that after they're interrogated, they are allowed to get dressed again, and then they're taken to a proper detention facility. But that is the reason that they are being round up. And we're hearing more and more stories of Hamas militants turning themselves in. By no means everyone, but it does seem to be that morale is beginning to crumble within Hamas. A very former high up member of Hamas, Yusuf al Munsir, he was a former communications director with Hamas, and he was interrogated, and he said that basically, Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas in Gaza, is delusional. He has delusions of grandeur. He's out only for himself. That many Hamas militants are now realizing that he misled them, that they're no longer committed to his cause. We're also seeing Gazans themselves, sometimes on video now, criticizing Hamas and saying that it's Hamas's fault that all this death and destruction is happening in Gaza, blaming them. And Israel is trying to play into this. They released this week receipts of jewelry produced by one of the heads of Hamas, the sons of the heads of Hamas. They have produced jewelry receipts for $25,000, trying to show and released it in Arabic with Arabic captions and explanations on social media. The idea being that, look, this is where the money is going. The children of your Hamas leadership are spending $25,000 on jewelry while you are going hungry. And it does seem like the street in Gaza is beginning to turn against Hamas, even a little bit. And even the Times of Israel has reported on this phenomenon. Um, I think what's important here is that Israel needs to see this as an opportunity. There's always this question of what is going to happen the day after, who is going to fill the power vacuum. If it's true that the public is more and more turning against Hamas, then this is a space for Israel to come in and be, if not the good guy, then at least a partner in Gaza's recovery. And I'm not sure exactly what form that would take. However, what you do see is Netanyahu over and over saying that there's no way the PA will lead in Gaza. He doesn't want some sort of international force in Gaza. And to me, this seems like Netanyahu, the first real sign that he is campaigning. Up until now, I do think the war has been conducted in a fairly straightforward way and a successful way, and a lot of it due in part to the help from Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who were in that war cabinet with him. However, when Netanyahu says that there's no way we can ever have Arab leadership in Gaza, I think he could be making a mistake doing that, and I think it's him trying to play to his own coalition, his own hard far right wing coalition, to show that he is tough. When in fact there could be an opportunity here for some sort of Arab power to maybe come in and take a leadership role, perhaps an international force overseeing the Palestinian Authority, a post-Mahmoud Abbas Palestinian Authority. The reason in the West Bank that there's so much support for Hamas is not that Hamas is necessarily so wonderful, but because they're so frustrated with the Palestinian Authority they have. So any Palestinian Authority that would be in Gaza would have to be a new one, revamped, not Mahmoud Abbas, who's in the 18th year of a 4-year term. But if public sentiment on the street is turning against Hamas, this is an opportunity for Israel. And I would hope that they are at least putting some thought into this, because this could seal some sort of relationship with Gaza that would last us and prevent Hamas or something like Hamas from taking over there. I want to turn to the story very quick before I get to your questions of Yuval Kasselman. If you remember, Yuval Kasselman was the Jewish Israeli who pulled his car over by the side of the road outside the entrance to Jerusalem. Two terrorists had been shooting at a bus stop, and he got out of his car and shot the terrorist, pretty much ending the terrorist attack. He was a hero. But then two off-duty reserve soldiers who'd just gotten back from Gaza started firing at him, at Yuval Kasselman, thinking that he was a terrorist too. So he went down on his knees and put his hands in the air and said, he threw his gun to the side and said, "I'm Jewish, don't shoot." And he was shot anyway in the head and was killed. And the soldier who shot him said that they mistook him for a terrorist. And it really brought out a lot of questions in Israel about ethics in battle, because in Israel, even a terrorist who executes, who shoots Jews, if he's on his knees with his hands in the air and no weapon in his hand, you are not allowed to shoot him. By law, according to Torah Neshek, the purity of arms, the IDF's code of ethics, you are to arrest him and question him, hold him in jail, but you are not allowed to shoot him if he's on his knees with his hands in the air and he's clearly unarmed and not a threat. Um, and he was shot anyway. And this soldier said, "I thought he was a terrorist." And the police said it really doesn't matter because there's. But what basically they said was, we don't need to do a further investigation. There's no sign of, there's no bullet still inside him. We saw an exit wound. The bullet left him. So we shouldn't do an autopsy on the body to try to get further evidence. This is what the Israeli police said. But in any case, the army exhumed his body anyway. Yuval Kastelman's body was dug up this past week, and lo and behold, they did find a bullet lodged inside him from the M16 of that reserve IDF soldier who claimed he didn't realize that he wasn't a terrorist. And what this really shows is that the police were lying, which adds another level of scandal to the story. It doesn't prove or disprove that the reserve soldier knew or didn't know that he tossed his gun to the side or that he thought he was no longer a threat. But it does show that there's a larger scandal going on here, and it further erodes trust in the police. Already, there's suspicions of the police in Israel simply because the police force is headed by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the hard right-wing politician who really for a long time was lobbying for his own personal police force of his own. And this adds another layer to it. The fact that a bullet was found inside him from that reserve soldier, even though the police claimed that there had been an exit wound and there would be no more bullets inside. Last point I want to bring up, I have a few others, but I'm going to have to choose here. Well, this one I think is important on a political level. I tend to be a member of the left. I always don't want to get too political here, but I will to some extent. I tend to vote left in Israeli politics. And I think I've expressed before my displeasure with the head of the Labor Party, Merav Michaeli. The reason I haven't liked her is because before the last election, she had a chance to form a coalition before the election with some other left parties, including Meretz, which is even more left than her, and Blue and White, which is Benny Gantz's party, and Yesh Atid, which is Yair Lapid's party. The way it works in Israel, I've mentioned this before, is that you don't vote for a person, you vote for the party. And only after the parties are elected do they form coalitions inside the government. Only then do they choose a prime minister. And if your party does not get 3.25% of the vote, your vote is just thrown out. So you have to really play this little game and try to figure out which party will actually get enough votes to be in there. And there was a real opportunity for the left to have a voice in this government if they had formed a coalition ahead of time. They could have just said, hey, when you vote for Meretz, you're also voting for Labor and Blue and White. That way they could make sure all their votes actually counted. But Merav Michaeli was so egotistical and so full of herself, as she has been for years, that she wouldn't form one of these coalitions. Anyway, this past week, she stepped down. These accusations and this kind of dissatisfaction with her leadership finally came to a head. Labor used to be the party of Israel up until 1982, I think it was, or maybe 70, maybe 78. Israel had never had a non-labor government. All governments were labor. It was Israel, and now labor in Israel is pretty much meaningless. And Meretz didn't even have seats in this last Knesset. The left has totally been pushed out. And a large reason why is because of Merav Michaeli's maneuvering. And so I'm happy to say that she is out. Interestingly enough, for us in the US, one of the candidates who might be the new head of labor, possibly, is none other than a reform rabbi, Rabbi Gilad Kariv. You can look him up, but he's a reform rabbi who's a member of the URJ movement. And it would be quite interesting to have him as the head of labor because not only is he extremely progressive, but he's also very aware of US-Israel relations and diaspora Jewry. And I think he would be a great choice. I've heard him speak. He's also really able to communicate the Israeli story to American audiences. And now more than ever, we need that as well. I want to get to your questions. A few of you wrote in with questions. Here, someone wrote, what is the likelihood of getting rid of Bibi anytime soon? Israel needs a leader who cares about Israel more than his own political survival. Well, in past weeks, I always said it might have been too soon to get rid of Bibi, that because of the war going on, it might make more sense to keep him on. However, I've started to change my tune. Now that Bibi more and more is saying that the only option for leading Gaza after the war is Israel, and not really seeming to pay attention that there might be an opportunity for Israel to be the good guys and help rebuild Gaza. It seems to me that he's campaigning, and I've now changed my tune. I actually think it's time for him to go, especially with we have Benny Gantz and we have Eisenkot. They could lead the war just fine. Netanyahu's trial just began. What would actually, so he has that political motivation as well. What would it actually take for him to leave during war? It would take either him to decide to resign, which I think is highly unlikely. It is not in his character. Uh, it could also be that the Knesset votes itself a no confidence vote and just decides we need a new leader. And they can do this by staying in power. Likud could still stay in power, but just decide they want new leadership. And already you see a few members of Likud indicating that they might want to be the ones to lead Likud instead of Bibi. So you're asking how it could happen. It would probably be more likely that within the Likud party itself, these politicians realize, you know what, being associated with Netanyahu is no longer helpful for me. Because at the end of the day, politicians are selfish. They think about their own self-interest. And when it becomes clear to them that their future as a politician is in danger, then they might abandon him. Netanyahu still has the majority. It won't happen without 5 members of Likud. Yes, someone points out that his majority, Likud only has a 5-member majority. This is not huge. All it would take is a few to turn. Or, like I said, just some Likud members to say we want different leadership, and they could still maintain the majority just with a different leader. Someone else wrote in with a question, and I want to get to the question that someone wrote in with is, why is Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon not taking Palestinian refugees in? Well, this is pretty much this is the story of the Palestinians, and there's sort of a joke, although it's not funny, but maybe it kind of is, that the Palestinians are the Jews of the Arab world, meaning that nobody wants them. Everyone likes to pick on them. Everyone likes to, make a big fuss out of them, but no one actually wants to help them at the end of the day. And believe me, it helps all these countries to have an Arab population so close to Israel that they can complain about and they can say Israel's mistreating, but no one actually wants them. So I would say it's highly unlikely that any of these countries would actually take the Palestinians in. Someone else said, would it make sense for Israel to just call on Hamas to surrender and that then we will end the war? I actually think that does make sense. Many times in conversation, Israeli leaders have said, well, if Hamas weren't doing this, or, if Hamas were to just release the hostages, then we would stop the fighting or at least take a pause. But I actually think it would be good for an Israeli leader to go on television and say, we are making a statement to Hamas. Lay down your weapons, come out with your hands up, stop the firing, release the hostages, and then we will end the war in Gaza. I think Israel could look like it's taking initiative here to end the conflict. How likely is that to happen? I would say highly unlikely, so I certainly wouldn't bet on it. There are other topics, believe it or not, that I wanted to get to. Employees of TikTok saying that there's anti-Semitism rife within the company, and this can help explain why Palestinian coverage gets so much more favoritism than pro-Israel coverage on TikTok. And of course, as an alum of the University of Pennsylvania, that is that whole story that I wanted to cover as well. But alas, we are out of time. I do want to remind you once again that if you are interested in these podcasts, you can go to those links right there. Inside Israel is now a podcast on Apple, on iTunes, on Spotify. And if you want to get the links to these future conversations of Inside Israel and see recordings of past episodes, including today's, it's on my website, which that last link right there, joelchasnoff.com. That is where I send out the links. That is where I post the recordings and any other information about stuff related to this conversation. Next week's conversation will most likely take place on Tuesday, the 19th, probably around this time, 7 p.m. Eastern. I do get the sense that you prefer 8 p.m. Eastern, but because of my schedule, I couldn't make that happen this week and next. But you'll get it in this Thursday's newsletter, the exact time, but most likely it'll be 7 p.m. Eastern next Tuesday, the 19th, a week from tomorrow. I really appreciate it when you write in with questions, when you send feedback. You can always contact me through the website, joelchasnoff.com. The link is there. I wish all of you a peaceful week. May we hope for only good things. Rak b'shalom. And thank you so much for joining. I'll see you next week.